I'll start off with the third one with about the basic concepts of what is a cost effectiveness, utility and a benefit analysis. See, I said that all three are full economic evaluations where you have at least two comparators and an assessment of both costs and effects in both the settings, and this is how we assess the do a full economic evaluation. The first and the most simpler type of economic evaluation is a cost effectiveness analysis. So, costing is similar across all these three different types of economic evaluations. The only difference lies in the way you assess the consequences or the outcomes or the effects, and that is how you define the design in terms of these three types. Cost effectiveness would use simpler measures of assessing effectiveness, and by simpler measures I would mean that simpler measures which only look at benefits in health outcomes which are directed more towards just the either simpler clinical measures. So, for example, effectiveness of a drug, when you go to a doctor and a doctor gives you a medicine, when you go back the next day to him, what does he ask you? Are you feeling okay? That is the first question that he has. Or if you had first gone with cough, then the question that in particular that he would be asking would be, how is your cough now? Is it less or is it more? So, that means resolution of symptoms becomes the most starting point of any health benefit. When you have a diseased state, for you to become normal, the first thing would be resolution of symptoms, and then you could go up and say, okay, resolution of symptoms is one thing, then the next thing is that the disease goes off. That means if there was a preventive interventions, then how many cases of an illness were you able to prevent? So, this is also an effectiveness measure. So, you gave vaccine in one district, you did not give vaccine in the other district, and you said that look at the number of children who fell sick with that disease which could have been prevented with vaccine, and then you see the difference between the two areas, and you say that this is the extent to which a vaccination could have prevented the number of illness episodes among children. So, this is also an effectiveness measure which is in terms of illnesses prevented. You could go further also and say how many deaths were prevented, and this also comes under the domain of cost effectiveness analysis. So, we started off with much more proximal outcome measures which were much more clinical outcome measures, to then going on to prevention of illness kind of indicators, and then go on to say how many deaths were prevented and all. So, that is these are all outcome or consequence measures which come under the ambit of a cost effectiveness analysis. Now, what it does not allow you to do a cost effectiveness analysis is to compare a different range of interventions which have different types of effects. So, and the example that we gave was yesterday was that if, for example, you have an intervention which is preventing childhood mortality, and a intervention in cancer control which is aimed at more of palliation. So, palliation is basically relieving pain and the extent of disability and problems with a patient who is, maybe with cancer, maybe with some other disease which have severe pain and all that. So, in such interventions, the outcome or the consequence is not only in terms of simply reducing death, mortality, or adding the years of life, but also in terms of improving the quality of life. And none of these initial measures of our cost effectiveness analysis had any way to assess how does the quality of life improve also. So, what we added in our cost utility analysis was that now we were measuring the effects not only in terms of the increment in quantity of life that you added with your intervention, but also the improvement in quality of life that you added, and we combined the two and we came up with a measure which was called as a quality adjusted life year. So, this is a cost utility analysis, but people go on to say that even with a cost utility analysis, you are not able to measure some of the intangible benefits which are neither in terms of quantity of life, neither in terms of quality of life. Example, there could be a mother whose child is sick in the hospital. When she is there tending to the sick child in the hospital, she was not able to take care of the second child who is at home. She was not able to feed that younger child rather who was at home. not able to breastfeed that child, or the child had to be the child had to be abstained from school, he was not sent to school, or she missed some important social function because the child was sick. All these are intangible losses as a result of illness. These intangible losses would not be covered even if you do a cost utility analysis. Or for example, mere suffering, mental agony of being on the bed, not being able to work, not being able to attend some social obligations, that is also something, that is also a benefit to the person whom you can pull up from sickness and make him healthy. He can be performing his roles and responsibilities within the family also. These are intangible benefits which are neither in terms of improvements in quantity of life nor in terms of nor very much in terms of quality of life, because quality is measured much more in terms of physical quality of life. So people came up with measures which tried to measure not only quantity of life, not only quality of life, not only but also these intangible benefits by monetizing the health benefits. And the methods that they use, remember I gave you an example of how much are you willing to pay to not meet an accident and be in the hospital. So when the person thinks about it, he makes the same microeconomic calculations that you do when you buy a jeans. How much utility would it give me when I become healthy, or if I was not to meet this accident? How much am I willing to pay for an intervention which would build a separate road for pedestrians, a separate path for pedestrians, and as a result you do not meet with such an accident? For example, if that was the preventive intervention that you were asking for. So this person, when he makes this mental calculation in his mind, he would think about what all problems have I faced with this accident, or in other words, what is the disutility of this accident to me? And disutility in terms of my being sick, my having broken my leg, being in this hospital, my wife has to be on my side, I cannot be with my child to take him to the school, not able to work, losing my income. All those things, they cross his mind as you think about when you make any purchase in the market. And that's those so-called microeconomic principles come into play when he makes this decision on how much is he willing to pay. And that value which he is willing to pay, in a sense, constitutes the health benefits in terms of quantity of life, quality of life, and intangible benefits. And he puts a monetary value to that. So this is how you monetize the health benefits, and you come up with the cost benefit analysis, where the health benefits are measured in terms of monetary terms. We did a small study where we were looking at road traffic injury patients, and we used these two approaches. One is this human capital approach you said yesterday. One way to see that what is the monetary benefit of a health disease state is that simply say that during the period of his disease he was not able to work for, let's say, X number of days, or when he started to work he was not able to work in his full potential, he was 25% less than what he would have worked because he had X disability, and you say that this was the reduced productivity as a result of his being in ill health, and you simply compute with his average daily wage and you come up with a value. This is human capital approach, but this human capital approach is only based on this productivity principle. But when you look at this willingness to pay approach, it takes into account all these intangible benefits also. So while we did this study, the extent to which the estimates from WTP are higher than the human capital approach, it's about 40 to 50% higher. It is about 1.5 times higher if you use the willingness to pay approach. That means these intangible benefits constitute approximately 50% of your total monetary value if you just were looking at the productivity losses. So intangible benefits are also something which are important for people when they are in that kind of a disease state. So that's why people sometimes advocate for using a cost benefit analysis, but then there are problems of equity. A rich man would be willing to pay high and a poor man would be willing to pay less. So then what do you do in that case? So a rich man's illnesses would have high value, a poor man's illnesses would have very low value. So all the diseases of rich man, the non-communicable diseases for that matter, would be very cost effective to treat, whereas a poor man's disease like diarrhea or ARI would be cost ineffective. So you would not like to allocate anything to that disease or make much more allocations to NCD control. So that's the problem, that's the caveat. So while there are benefits, there are problems. The ideal way to, when you are in that top and right quadrant of the cost effectiveness plane, that means your new intervention is more effective, but it is also more costly. So your ICER value would come to be something like you have to spend an extra, let's say 10,000 rupees to save one death, or you have to spend 10,000 rupees extra to avert one DALI. Let's say that is the kind of measure that you get. Now the question is for you to decide which would you consider cost effective and which would you not consider cost effective. The ideal way to go about is to have societal valuations, because ultimately it is a societal decision on how much value do we place on a human's life. So the economist's job stops at this point by giving up this estimate. The judgment process starts thereafter, and this judgment process becomes very important, because this is something which is going to influence the policy. Now, as I said, that the ideal way would be to have societal valuations, but societal valuations do not exist in literature. So if that is not the case, then what do you do? So one of the trade-off approaches that have been recommended is that in any country, people should be at least willing to pay that much amount of money which is the average productivity of a person in the country. And so if you consider that as something which is, the value that you place on a person's life in that country, then at least you should be willing to spend that much amount of money to save a person's life. If you were to use efficiency analysis to guide your policy, how can you still make it more equitable? So this is our question. There are various ways to do that. One of the ways is set higher thresholds for illnesses or problems which occur among the poor. So if you set higher thresholds, interventions which cost a higher amount of money also would remain cost effective or remain within the cost effectiveness limit. Set lower thresholds for the diseases of the rich. This is what some countries do. Or alternatively, you classify diseases, or if you think that there are some priority diseases, some diseases which are very high burden or very, very important to treat, or you think that ethically it is not at all correct to deny care to such people, set higher thresholds for those diseases. This is one way. Or there is another way, people go on to do what they call as an extended cost effectiveness analysis. The extended cost effectiveness analysis also takes into account some equity concerns. You would then try and see the cost effectiveness of interventions not only at a pooled level, but among different population groups based on their wealth status. How cost effective are these interventions among the poor, among the rich, and likewise. And then for those interventions which are cost effective among the poor, even if they are not cost effective at the overall level, you tend to take them. So there are ways to actually address those equity concerns which are there in an economic evaluation. And there is a whole range of analysis which revolves around this domain of sensitivity analysis, which tries to take care of all the kinds of assumptions that you make in an economic evaluation. So for example, if you did an economic evaluation and you came up with a set of assumptions and said that the intervention is very cost effective, where do you think that the intervention is going to be cost effective? So there is a ORS, oral rehydration solution, for diarrheal cases. where do you think ORS is going to be more cost effective, in a setting where there is high burden of diarrhea or low burden of diarrhea? High burden diarrhea. So in your analysis, if you assumed that the diarrheal burden is, let's say, the illness rate is, let's say, about 10% is the prevalence of diarrhea. So in your sensitivity analysis, you can say what is the worst possible case, that if you have a low incidence of diarrhea, how much it can go. Let's say it is 3%. You put a 3% value to that, and say right now the ORS is costing, let's say, 2 rupees per packet. What if it were to cost 10 rupees per packet? So you make all the worst assumptions, then run the analysis, and then see what is the outcome. If your intervention still remains cost effective, what reason do you have to believe that it is not an efficient way to allocate resource? They'll give you a quick glimpse of what was there in those readings. Okay, and also discuss some of those things that we didn't get a chance to talk about yesterday, and that is primarily upon, and that is to touch on what you said, that what is the kind of research ideas that we can have where we apply this economic perspective to our HPSR. So examples are which interventions work and to what extent. For example, user charges, demand side financing mechanisms. You have voucher schemes being tried everywhere. Okay? Gujarat started off this trend. Well, what do you understand by demand side financing mechanism? Demand side financing mechanism means, traditionally in public sector, what have we tried to do when we tried to finance healthcare? We tried to set up facilities, we tried to create people there, and we paid in the facilities. So it was a supply side financing primarily. We created the infrastructure, created manpower and everything. But then we realized over a period of time that despite having created all that large infrastructure, people are not coming to our facilities. So what do? So what we do is, we finance through the demand side. When the person comes to visit the health facility, we pay that money. This is demand side. So money follows the patient. Don't link it to the supply side, link it to the demand side. As many people come, as much money you pay. So whether these interventions work or not, and if they work, then to what an extent. Performance based payments. You're having debates on performance based payments, whether you should have incentives. So many of you said that there are incentive schemes for different cadre of healthcare workers. Some of you suggested also, that these are things that could have been used and all that. Task shifting, whether it is possible to do or improve the utilization of care. If there is no doctors, then can we have nurses do the job? If we don't have anesthetists, can we still have comprehensive emergency obstetric care by training doctors, 3-month capsule course on anesthesia, 3-month capsule course on obstetrics? Can we do that? That's task shifting. So a lot of interventions we can assess in terms of whether these work or not and to what extent. There are umpteen examples in the setting that I work on. These entire examples that I am taking, these are actually in practice. Doctors being trained, short-term 3-month training for anesthesia, 3-month training for radiology, 3-month training for obstetrics, and they go on and work in field in CHC district hospitals and all, and they work as in the capacity of an anesthetist, in the capacity of a specialist, basically a radiologist or an anesthetist or a gynecologist doing cesarean sections. Okay? So this is task shifting. Some examples from your readings. This is something that we looked at in Haryana when the user charges were first implemented as part of the health sector reforms prior to even NRHM. So the user charges were implemented, and there were 3 districts where the user charges were implemented, and the remaining districts did not have the user charges. So what we looked at was one district where the user charge was implemented, the top one, and the bottom one where the user charge was not implemented. And the user charge was implemented somewhere around this time, and what you see between these 2 districts where the charge was implemented and the other, you see that there was quite a secular trend, similar trend, where there was no user charge and it started declining. There's no causal relationship that I can prove, but some indication that probably it was the user charges which led to a decline. Another example, recently the government thought that, and this is a concept which a lot of different institutions and different states find very attractive, have package rates. This is nothing but a user charge. Institutions justify it on the ground that having a user charge would create some revenue for their own hospital, and they can use it to improve quality. But do patients want that kind of quality which comes from their money, or they are happy with the kind of quality that is already existing, but they don't have to pay for much in the hospitals? A look at data from the state shows, if you just don't think about that there is something which is in between here, then you would say, and if you draw a line from here to here, this is what most of the people in the state services tend to do, and they would say that the surgeries are increasing. So even after user charges, the surgeries have improved, but this is actually a secular trend. Things were going in that direction, and so they are going in this direction. But you break this time series into two parts, pre-intervention and post-intervention. What you actually find is that the trend reversed post-intervention. It was going very much up pre-intervention. So this user charge or the surgical package program or this package rate system actually adversely affected the utilization of surgical care in this setting. Assessment of health system. So this was the first kind of positivist research idea, which interventions work and to what extent. The second example, the second kind of major domain is assessment of health systems from efficiency viewpoint. Okay, the third session that we had. What is the ideal allocation of ambulances? How many ambulances should we station? Which is the most optimum number of ambulances? How many ambulances per 1,000 population, or per district, or per region, per square kilometer? How many ambulances should we have? Which is a better strategy, 1 or 2 ANMs? How many sex workers should be covered under a targeted intervention program for prevention of HIV? Should a new vaccine be introduced? If a new vaccine should be introduced, what should be the price of this vaccine? What should be the price of this vaccine so that it becomes cost effective? The last one, which services should be part of the benefit package, or alternate delivery strategies? Should we have a pure public model, or should we have a public private model, or should we have a completely private model? Which is the most cost effective model of service delivery? So the second question is also a question of service delivery. How do we deliver services? 1 ANM or 2 ANM? Similar is the kind of question. Do we have a public model, or do we have a public plus private model, or do we have a pure private model? Which is more cost effective? Which is the one which is more efficient? And let's have some kind of evidence. So look at the female sex worker targeted intervention programs. The last line says cost per Delhi averted, incremental cost effectiveness ratio. Would somebody like to interpret this value of $10.9? What does it mean? Okay, so I'll give you a context. The two comparator scenarios were in the evolution of National AIDS Control Program for prevention of HIV. They used to have something which was a mass media approach for prevention till about before the onset of second phase of NSEP, which was about 2003 or 4. After that, they introduced a strategy which was called a targeted intervention program, that apart from general mass media for the entire population, we have a targeted approach for prevention among the ones who are in high risk group. For example, female sex workers, men having sex with men, or injecting drug users. So this is kind of a comparison between mass media as an approach for prevention of HIV and then mass media plus TI. So TI as a targeted intervention as a strategy was added over and above mass media. So what does this 10.9 value tell you? It costs $10.9 extra to implement targeted interventions as compared to mass media alone to avert one extra Delhi. So to avert one extra Delhi, this is the benefit I am saying. To avert one extra Delhi, you have to spend an extra about $11 when you implement targeted intervention as compared to mass media alone. This is what it means. Let's say the first line, $819. What does this mean? Context is, this is an evaluation where you looked at a universal immunization program with routine vaccines in place, and now a UIP with a pentavalent vaccine added to the UIP. So, these are the two scenarios. So, to avert one DALI using pentavalent vaccine, you have to spend an extra $819 as compared to a mere UIP program alone. So, between sex workers targeted intervention program and Hib vaccine, which one would you invest your resources in? $11 compared to $819. $11 is too less. So, we will invest in that intervention, which gives us much better value for the same DALI averted. We have to spend just $11 there and $820 there. So, that is the extent of that's what the thing is. DALI is now a common measure. So, with targeted intervention program, with any prevention program for HIV, okay, what do you intend to do? You intend to educate the for example, the sex workers to use condoms during when they have commercial sex activity. With higher condom usage, you expect that there would be lesser transmission of HIV. So, even if there is a HIV positive client or a HIV positive sex worker and she has sex with a client, there is not going to be transmission of HIV. So, there is the outcome is reduction in HIV infections. As a result of that, reduction in the mortality as a result of HIV, plus improvement in, if there is reduction in HIV illness, then there is also improvement in quality of life of those many people who were prevented from getting HIV, because if they had HIV, they would also have opportunistic infections, they would also have all the types of problems which an HIV patient has, social stigma and all those things. So, the quality of life also improves for those people who were prevented from having. So, in terms of both the quantity of life added by preventing HIV and preventing HIV mortality, and by improving the quality of life by reducing the number of illnesses, HIV illnesses, you club these two together, you come up with disability adjusted life year. Same is true for a case of Hib, the vaccine. You prevented kids from getting pneumonia or meningitis as a result of Hib vaccine, Hib component within the pentavalent vaccine. So, if I just break down the DALI into two parts, then DALI in two parts would mean it has two components. One is years of life lived, and the other is years of life lived in disability. Sorry, years of life lost, not lived. So, for example, if you had 10 people who died and they died at the age of 50 years with an average life expectancy of 65 years, everybody lived 15 years less. So, the years of life lost are 15 times 10, which is 150, plus if you also prevented some illnesses, and let us say those illnesses lasted over a period of half a year. For the sake of example, there is an illness which lasts over a period of half a year, and during this half a year you are half of your full health. Okay. So, if there are 10 people who fall sick, then 10 people fall sick for half a year, that means 5 years, and during those 5 years they live half of full health. So, 2.5 are the years of life lived in disability. So, you add 150 plus 2.5, this is 152.5, this becomes DALI, this is YLL plus YLD. Okay. Now, I give you another question. You have a patient who is having cough and cold. He is having cough which goes on for almost 3 months in a year. This exacerbates during the winter season. Off and on during a week he has to abstain from his job for about a day in a week. During those 3 months he keeps coughing, but then he has to see a doctor at least once in 15 days. He has to take a pill every day. He sometimes feels it odd when he has to sit in company of his friends. How do you rate the quality of his life on a scale of 0 to 1, where 0 is death and 1 is perfect health?
He's still productive.
No, I don't. I just want a value.
Around
0.8, 0.9. I think that he is much more closer to reality. This is a case of more or less COPD. You know, old man coughing all the time, sputum and all that. He's almost quite close to, I mean, so look at now the disability, extent of disability. So the disability is dependent on the disease state. And when you give a description or when you give try to see this valuation of disability, you would not just think about the disease state as such, but all the parameters, including the social factors of that disease, economic factors of that disease, the health state itself, you are not able to walk around and all that. So the disability would be different for every illness.
Who decides the Daly figure? Is it the economist who decides that what is the figure for Daly?
Very good question. There are two measures. One is a disability adjusted life year, there is a quality adjusted life years. The quality weights have been assessed mostly by societal valuations. So patients evaluate themselves. So whose valuation should we take? I mean, this is the essential question. Is it the patient's valuation? Is it your valuation as a general public, or is it the providers or the doctor's valuation? And then there's another one who is an economist. So his valuation. Ideally, it is the patient's valuation which should be taken. Now the problem is you don't have patient's valuations available for every disease. So for quality weights, you still have some valuations available, but most of them come from developed country settings. So you don't have quality estimates for each disease for developing country context like India. To avoid this kind of a problem, some experts some year sat down at Geneva and they themselves came up with these disability measures. And they were given a description, just as I gave you description of diseases. So for example, you were experts for me, I gave you a description, and then you gave me your opinion about how much do you think is this person disabled. But the way I asked this question is entirely a different methodology, and that tries to hopefully take away all those biases. So then I use those disability adjusted life years, which were once set by somebody in Geneva. A group of experts sat together. Recently now, in the revised global burden of disease estimations, which have now been done currently, 2010 revision, there they have had societal valuations of disability weights also. So that is why most of the countries from the developed country settings tend to use QALY as a measure, because there they have quality weights available. Most of the evaluations from developing country context tend to use DALY as a measure, because they don't have the quality assessments from their setting, but they have this luxury of using experts' opinion. And so we tend to use, so in most of our work also we tend to rely upon those disability weights and then calculate DALY than a QALY. Okay, do you know how Ayurveda defines health?
Yeah.
It is the harmony of fire, wind and water. Do you know how yin and yang define health? It is another definition. There is another definition which says homeostasis of the internal bodily organs and all that. There are about 100 definitions of health. When there is no definition of health, how do we measure health is another problem. This is another problem which we have to face when we have to do consequences. So after, passing through a series of different evolutions of how you measure health, people have tended to agree that if you are somehow able to combine the effects of any intervention in terms of how much does it improve health in terms of adding the quantity of life and adding quality of life. Ultimately, these are the two domains of health that you would be interested in, that you want to live longer. How do you rate a country's health when you make comparisons? You see the life expectancy of Japan and you see the life expectancy of Swaziland, and then you say that Swaziland has half the life expectancy, and as a result people living in Japan are healthier than Swaziland. Don't you do this? What else am I doing? I am also looking at the years of life added. I am also making a rather improvement over that by adding quality dimension, by adding disability dimension. So what epidemiologists do is only look at burden in terms of life expectancy, or people do compare just the death rates, crude death rate, India versus within India, how do we rate the health systems in different states? We look at the IMR. Do you think IMR is a way to actually look at the how health systems are performing or what is the health of the population? But yes, it is also a very sensitive indicator. Or the crude death rate is also a sensitive indicator. So there are different ways of assessing health. The root cause of the problem is we don't know what health is. That is also a notion, just as happiness is a notion. So the complexity of the problem starts with the definition of health itself. If one day we are able to define health, we would be able to measure health also. So far, the advancement that science has made in terms of measurement of health status has been up to the limit of this indicator. It is, I completely agree, not completely flawless measure. It also has its sets of problems. There is a WHO questionnaire which is called as EuroQol, which assesses the quality of life. In children, there is a questionnaire which is PedsQoL. So this is a questionnaire which assesses the quality of life of the child who is in sickness. The respondent might be different for the child. The respondent is the mother. The mother tells you the responses of those questions. Just as you every day you read in a newspaper, how much do you love your spouse? You have a questionnaire. You say that whether do you say hello in the morning, do you do this, do you do that, and then they tell you how much you love. If you can get a newspaper questionnaire to tell you how much you love your spouse, why don't you want to trust a questionnaire which can assess the health? So this quality of life is a questionnaire. It will ask you a series of 10 questions, for example, and then whatever responses you make, it will give you some marks for each question, and then you total the marks, and then you grade your quality of life. Or the other way is, you simply use a kind of a visual analog scale, as I did with all of you. You say, ki, on a scale, how much do you rate the health of this person? So this is easier to do with a literate population, people who are able to understand that health state which I am describing. But for an illiterate person, it might be difficult to understand and comprehend all those things. So there you simply ask them, are you able to walk? Do you have any problems in mobility? Do you have problems in self-care? Do you have problems? Do you have pain? Are you able to do your daily activities in life? And what else? There's one more domain. And then there are 5 options within each questions. Okay, 5 options within each questions. So 5 questions, 5 options. If you do permutation combination, this becomes 243 health states. Let's just run through and see what are the different research ideas that you can have for HPSR, because I have just 5 minutes more to go. So level of technical efficiency, how efficient is your public sector? This is also there in your reading, and as you see, about 40% are operating at more than 80% efficiency. Public sector is actually efficient, and if you total these two together, about more than 80% are functioning at about more than 60% efficiency level. This also gives you an evidence of how much should the government negotiate on price of the vaccines. One of the major determinants of cost effectiveness of a given intervention is the price of that intervention. This analysis also allows you to inform the government or the policy maker. For example, in one of the cases in cervical cancer screening in Thailand, they found cervical cancer screening is not cost effective. But then they told the government, if you are able to negotiate with the provider, with the supplier, the kit for cervical screening by about half, then your intervention becomes cost effective. That means if you are able to lower down the price of the test, then then this becomes cost effective in your setting. The government negotiated in Thailand and they were able to bring it down to 10% of the market price. So this is the kind of information that the government needs. If hip vaccine is cost effective, it is cost effective, fine. These are the different ICER values. What are the different ICER values with different levels of price of the vaccine? At this time when this vaccine was being used on a pilot basis, the Serum Institute of India was giving the vaccine at a price of $3 a dose. But they were willing to offer the vaccine at $1 a dose if you had introduced this vaccine in the routine schedule, UIP. So that's why we ran this analysis to say that how much would it improve the efficiency of delivering pentavalent vaccine if you are able to reduce down the price from $3 a dose to $1 a dose. How much should the ambulances be, how many ambulances should you station in a given area? This is the level at which different ambulances are operating in terms of the distances travelled and in terms of the average cost. You see, as you increase the scope of work, your unit cost keeps coming down. There is a cost attached to this training, but there are so many chairs which are empty. I keep adding more participants to this training course and my unit cost keeps coming down. There would come some point in time when all the seats are full in this room, and if then I have to add another student, I have to break this wall and extend, or this wall, and then extend this seminar room also with this seminar room, then only I can adjust more participants. That adds another fixed cost and my average cost would go up immediately. So I need to find out what is that last point till which my average cost keeps coming down. This shows us that about 4 to 5 patients a day, if the ambulance is traveling, is transporting, then your ambulances are functioning at a very efficient level. What is it that is more efficient, 1 ANM versus 2 ANM? How much does the cost increase with 2 ANMs? What is the relationship between the cost of human resources and the cost of providing delivery? How equitable are our health systems in terms of utilization? Is it the rich who are using services more, or is it the poor who are using services more? This is a very, very important question. A lot of people are struggling with trying to answer this question. Ultimately, government is spending so much money. Who is able to use this public subsidy? Is it the rich or the poor? So you break down your service utilization rates by your, for example, income quintiles. So starting from the poorest to the richest, and look at the utilization for institutional delivery. What you find is that it's the richest, it's the poorest who use it the more, the richest. So there is a steep gradient between the richest and the poorest, which means the poor are using your services more. It's an equitable system. You look at the hospitalization rates across different states in public and private sector, and what you find is that not too much different at the overall level, 39% to 29 to 36, not too much different. If you look at the private sector, it is 29% here, 68% in the richest. Which do you think is more equitable? Public. But then there is a lot of variation across different states. Okay? So this why question will come in the relativist set of questions. So these are the positivist set of questions. Assessing the responsiveness of healthcare system. This is the third objective of our health system. How does responsiveness vary with the way you pay your providers? If you pay fee for service versus you pay a capitation versus you pay a salary. Why do doctors in the public sector are not able to perform that much if you pay them by salary versus if you start paying them an RSBY incentive alongside? A lot of analysis and much of the economic analysis makes sense to use it before you have actually done something. What is the fun of having implemented something, wasted your resources, and then seeing whether it is efficient or not? The good part is to see whether it would be efficient to have this program or to have this service in the first place. And if you have to do that, then much of your work has to rely on models. The first question that the the Joint Secretary Policy is entrusted with the task of preparing the National Health Assurance Mission. When he takes the entire plan to the Additional Secretary, the first question that he asks him is, how much will it cost? So, preemptive question is, how much will it cost? The program has not been implemented. So, you need those estimates. How much would universal health care cost in your country? You have not implemented it. You have to make assumptions. How much would be the utilization? What would be the cost? What would be the provider behavior? What would be the patient demand side factors? You have to make assumptions. There is no way out of it. Relativist perspective, explanatory or exploratory purpose. Okay, you saw that equity was, you assessed the equity in the positivist framework. In the relativist framework, you will ask, why is the equity different? You saw the hospitalization rates in that slide, but why is it that the equity for hospitalization is different in different states? And perhaps your answer could be the extent of public spending. Increase the public spending and your health systems become more equitable. Why do some interventions work well in one setting whereas they don't work in some other settings? Voucher scheme launched in Gujarat was a success, reasonable success. It flopped in Haryana. Why is it so? What was the reason? Incentives work for some providers, for some kind of providers, do not work for other kinds of providers. They work for some kinds of services, do not work for other kinds of services. Yesterday we all agreed and we saw that the principles of insurance was to have risk pooling across the sick and the healthy. The basic reason is to offer risk protection, financial risk protection. Why is it then that your publicly financed health insurance schemes still do not tend to meet their desired goals? So those why questions are going to be answered through this kind of an approach or analysis. Why is there a skewed distribution of healthcare providers in the rural or the urban or likewise? Why is it that there is more competition in drug procurement in one state than the other? So these are all the why questions. These are ideas I am giving you. I am not stating these in the form of questions, but just to stimulate you to think of the kind of questions that you can. Tamil Nadu has a very competitive drug procurement system. Haryana has also introduced a decentralized procurement system. A centralized procurement and decentralized distribution system. But why it doesn't not have that kind of competition among the firms who are bidding? What is it that happens there in one state which doesn't happen in the other state? Understanding the demand for healthcare. There's a whole lot of questions to be answered in this kind of forum. Why is it that women, when they have to take ANC care, they go to a private sector, but when they have to deliver, they come back to the public sector? Why such a differential behavior? Why is it that at the overall level of outpatient care, about 60 to 70%, currently 70% people go to private sector, but when it comes to neonates or children, it's about 95% that they go to private sector. In RSBY, you have a cap at 5 members only per household which can be empaneled. Some members, if there is a family of 6 or 7, some members are excluded. The household has to make a decision. What factors operate? Which is the kind of selection mechanism which operates? Why is it that one kind of member is excluded? Is it the old who is excluded, elderly, or is it the young child who is excluded, or is it the lady of the house who is excluded? Who gets excluded and why? So those are the kind of ideas or research things that I thought could be quite relevant for you to understand, besides the opening slide which said that almost everything has to be analyzed from this perspective.